Hi, everyone, and thank you for joining us. We're now going on the 11th hour of the 2022 World Rainforest Day Summit. So if you're still with us, thanks for sticking around. If you're just joining, welcome and happy World Rainforest Day to everyone. This panel is going to be about wildlife conservation. So, of course, we're here to talk about rainforests, but an essential part of rainforest is the biodiversity and the wildlife within it. And we're joined today by three in person and one pre-recorded. So four leaders in wildlife conservation. And we're just going to go ahead and get right into introductions. Nabil, go ahead and introduce us to Susan, please.
Hi, everyone. My name is Dr. Susan Cheyne, and I'm with the Borneo Nature Foundation. As the name suggests, we work in Borneo, the Indonesian part. And we have been working out there doing conservation work for over 20 years. I'm sorry I can't be with you. Time differences are challenging at best. But just a quick sort of update. Obviously, hopefully you can see behind me one of the many species that we work to understand and protect, the gibbon. Obviously orangutans as well, clouded leopards, but everything, including dragonflies, trees. We try to take a landscape ecosystem level approach to conservation, but making sure that we absolutely work with communities and people and outreach and education to try and do everything. Conservation issues are highly diverse and many multifaceted and so many problems, which can seem overwhelming and challenging, but I think that also presents the opportunity that therefore there are so many possible solutions. And we have a great opportunity to challenge and find many solutions, from low tech, high tech. We use camera traps, we use drones, we use in our education books and plays, we use apps, we use digital games, all sorts of different things to try to figure out what we're doing. And our main focus is across three landscapes in the province of Central Kalimantan, which all face their own challenges. They have their own unique types of habitat. One is a deep peat swamp forest, and one is quite challenging mountains. They have their own threats. Many of the big threat that many people might be aware of in Borneo is palm oil, but there's also fragmentation. Fire in particular is a huge problem for peatlands, which can be cleared. And even though the above ground vegetation is gone, the peat below ground is still there and can be very deep, up to 18 meters. And dry peat can really burn. So it means we need to think of a lot of different solutions. We need to understand the wildlife in the forest to be able to better protect it, but also to be able to tell people what's there. Have you heard of a flat-headed cat? Have you heard of a gibbon? A pangolin? All these different creatures that many people don't know about. If you don't know about something, it's difficult to try and work to protect it. So a very brief overview, and I am sorry I can't be part of the panel discussion, but I think the key thing that I kind of want to get across with this is the importance of having a multifaceted biodiverse approach to protecting biodiversity. But absolutely, and I cannot stress this enough, our conservation action has to be underpinned by good science, understanding the forests, the wildlife, and people. Whether that science is behavioral ecology with wildlife, or social science, or working with communities, and understanding and using local ecological knowledge of people who live in and around these habitats is absolutely critical. So check us out online. We are on a multitude of social media platforms. Our social media is in English and Indonesian and French. Borneo Nature Foundation, and possibly, if you want to get in touch with me, perhaps my email will be shared by the panel. Yes, I wish the panelists a great discussion and have an excellent time. And thank you for the opportunity to briefly introduce Borneo Nature Foundation and the work we're doing with a multitude of partners, including many government partners in Indonesia. Thank you very much.
All right, so Now let's go ahead and meet our panelists for joining us live. Let's go Teri, Sam, and Denis. And each of you just introduce yourselves, your organizations, and give us some background. What's your work with wildlife? Where do you work? And what's it like?
Thanks, Nia. It sounds busy where you are. Sounds like motorcycles nearby. Can you hear me? Is everything okay?
We're just saying that's definitely Sam's motorcycles, not mine.
Oh, it's Sam. Oh, sorry.
You don't remember the motor cars, Teri?
Yes, I do. I don't know why. It's just because Nia was talking. I assumed it was her. Okay, so my name is Teri Allendorf. I'm a conservation biologist. I am the executive director of community conservation, which has been around since the 1980s and has worked in about 15 countries, doing nearly 30 different projects to conserve biodiversity, but those are all based around working with communities to directly conserve wildlife. And so we work with a multitude of species across Latin America, Africa, and Asia. And actually, two of our partners are Sam and Denis. So it's exciting that we're all here together getting a chance to sort of do this and interact together. So I'll let them go ahead. Thank you.
That's my cue. Sorry about the background noise. My name's Sam Shanee. I'm English primatologist. I've been living and working in Peru since 2007, 15 years, and I'm co-founder and director of an NGO called Neotropical Primate Conservation. As the name suggests, we work in South and Central America, mainly in conservation of primates, but we use primates as flagships for calling attention to general conservation. So you can't have a primate without the forest, and you can't have a forest without all its different components, the wildlife part that we're talking about today. We work, as well as Teri said, focused with local communities, as it's very rare nowadays, if it ever was possible, to find areas that are uninhabited by people. So you have to work with them towards conservation and for their benefit as well. That's very briefly where we work and what we do.
Thank you, and I suggest that is my cue as well. My name is Denis Ndeloh. I am the founder of a community-based Biosynergy management, a local NGO based in Cameroon. Like Sam, I'm a primatologist from Cameroon, and I have lived in Cameroon and done a lot of work on primate conservation, generally wildlife conservation under different portfolios. But right now, I also do a lot of work for wildlife management, which is, although very similar concepts, a different kind of understanding and arrangements. I work as director of wildlife management for the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board in the Canadian Arctic. So I have dual responsibility of managing the NGO in Cameroon and also working for wildlife in the Arctic. The work of today, I'm going to talk about the Cameroon NGO, of course. The work of CBBM, as it is abbreviated, is to empower community solutions to wildlife management and the protection of forest. And we are a young NGO, so unlike others, we are still looking for partners, and we are actively working on building our partner base. But our work focuses on indigenous people, empowering indigenous people to be able to sit at a table and make decisions about wildlife that they depend on for their existence, basically. We are also working with some of our partners to encourage the protection of forests that has already been designated as community forestry or community reserves in Cameroon, and how we can empower the local entities that manage those forests to protect them for biodiversity. And we are also interested in protecting new chimpanzee habitats in the northern parts of Cameroon. Yes, that's all for now. Thanks.
Thank you all. So I want to start by setting the stage a little bit. I'd love for each of you to talk a little bit about what the main threats to wildlife are in the areas you work. And I know most of you work in quite a few different areas. So maybe just pick one or two to focus on, maybe the rainforest ones. And we can go Teri, Sam, Denis again.
Okay. So because we worked in so many projects in so many places, we, could pick any one and come up with the whole list of threats that have ever been discovered. In terms of specifically sort of, let's see, categorizing them, working with communities, for example, one thing that's really important is for us to recognize when communities are trying to protect an area from outsiders, right? Threats coming from outside, like logging companies or poachers, from their own behavior, things they want to change. So in Cameroon, actually, I had a chance to visit with Denis this year, and a couple of communities sort of want to take over management themselves, and they want to learn more about how to sustainably harvest and how to monitor their wildlife. So they're not a threat per se themselves, but they do see that they need to maybe change behaviors and modify, and they need the knowledge and capacity and help to do that. So I'm not going to I'll let these guys get into specific threats at their sites, and I'll just kind of keep it general like that in terms of just being sure we recognize, which threats are coming from where, and then there's different ways to handle those, right? When they're coming from outside, we got to do a lot more with policy and law enforcement and things like that. But there's so much to do even inside the community to help them both combat, outside threats, but then even figuring out their own behaviors and how they want to manage an area. And I'll stop there and let Sam go.
Thanks, Teri. I'm not sure if I'm going to be particularly more specific. I think in all the areas we work, we have projects at the moment in Colombia and Argentina and in Peru, in several sites in each country. And it boils down to two major issues, which is deforestation and to a slightly lesser extent, hunting or trafficking, whatever. And you can go to, the specific cause, like in this forest here, it's land being cleared for cattle ranching or rice planting. Or you can go backwards to a much broader scale. What is the reason that people need to keep clearing more and more land for cattle ranching or rice cultivation? Then you get into the politics, then you get into development strategies, corruption, mismanagement of resources, internal migration within countries, and so on, civil war, things, not quite civil war, but the situation in Colombia, for example, is very, very touch and go recently. So it all depends. With our work, we don't try and fix, the global problem. We don't try and change the UN's mind on something, or national government other than the countries we work in. But as Susan mentioned, all conservation should be based on, in her words, sound science, on knowledge, on what is going on the ground. So by doing projects on a small scale with local communities, you get to see the final proximal cause of the threat. But you can then trace that back, and by producing evidence of what can work to mitigate those threats, then that can, snowball, grow to a larger regional scale, hopefully get back to the policy level. Sorry that wasn't very specific, but I think in all the world's tropics, you're going to find something very similar to that.
I agree with you, Sam. I think if you were to ask wildlife species, elephants, chimpanzees, monkeys, what the threat is, they will tell you humans are the threat, right? So human activity is the threat to wildlife and wildlife existence everywhere. And sometimes in some projects, the threat is not coming from the community immediately adjacent to the wildlife habitat. It is encroachment from other humans in other places that is causing the problem. For example, in the Adamawa region of Cameroon, where we are planning, the community has invited us to do some intervention there. One of the major threats is that cattle grazers from neighboring countries come into their forest and they burn the forest in order to provide pasture for their cattle, and they do that illegally. They are not allowed to do that, but they do that anyway. If you go down to the southern part of Cameroon, where we also are working with a community there, the threat is that first, encroachment, these are indigenous people, so encroachment from known indigenous people into what has been designated as their own forest. And also the threat comes from within themselves, is the uncoordinated use of the forest, which is making, splitting it up and making patches that are not very good for wildlife protection. So the threats to hunting is a major threat. If you want to go more broad across the region, hunting is, and wildlife trafficking and exploitation and the illegal trafficking on the underground network of illegal trafficking of all kinds of animals remains a present threat. But it's just, I think, main threat, I go back to how I started, the main threat is human activity threatens wildlife survival everywhere in the world.
Thank you. So I want to quickly jump back to something that Teri mentioned, and then both Sam and Dennis briefly touched on with that sort of human element. But Teri talked about working with communities to address any of the threats posed to wildlife. And so I want to ask, how do you, obviously this is a loaded question, but briefly,
oh no, you frozen, Nia.
Perhaps we could assume she's going to ask, how do you get communities involved in the conservation
to address?
Wait, I actually heard both of you talking at the same time, and now how do we what? Sorry.
I think I'm back, right? So I was going to ask how you go about building those community relationships that are necessary to work together to address those issues.
Should we go backwards this time, or? Yeah,
let's go backwards. Let's go with Dennis.
I firmly believe that if outside, the community must want it first. That is why I think what is common between Teri, Sam, and myself is that we believe in community conservation. The community must want it first for it to, you can point to a problem, but the community must tell you that your problem is their problem and they want to address it. And if they need your help, you can help them address it. That is the recipe for success. It has to start from the community. It has to be motivated by, they have to be motivated enough to participate. And that must be based on what the FPIC, which is free, prior, and informed consent. Without these ingredients, it is very difficult to achieve any success, in my view.
I think I'm next. I completely agree with what Dennis said, and I've given this example several times in other talks. When we look over the work we've done in Peru, there's one community, the first one we arrived in, that we've had always the most difficulty with working with. And that was the community that we arrived to and then began conservation, as in we arrived and we brought conservation to the community. All the other communities that we've worked with have come through them hearing of our work and inviting us to help them conserve their area, not a project placed from outside. It came from within the community. That has been one of the major, if not the biggest aid, is the communities, as Dennis said, need to want it. Perhaps they don't express it in the way that we would, trying to get funding or trying to write papers or influence policy. But they're the people who live and survive off their local natural resources. So if they've seen them disappearing, they've seen these scarcities of wildlife or firewood or even fresh water, rivers drying because of too much deforestation, they already understand that they need conservation. And then in our work, at least, mainly we offer to the local communities the way to legally register their conservation projects, legally register their protected area, or get certification for their eco-friendly product. There's many different options, but that's the main thing. Also, with communities, you have to be honest. If you go in there making lots of promises like, we're going to make you all millionaires from tourism, and they're not millionaires from tourism a few years down the line, they're not going to want the project anymore. You have to go in and you have to be honest. Like, in my opinion, and to not exaggerate too much, the world is dying. We are killing it. And there are very simple steps that can be done to slow that down or stop it on a local scale or on a large scale. But just, yeah, being honest, living with the people, speaking to the people is the best way to get communities on board, not to give false expectations or promises.
Yeah, I think both everything Denis and Sam said, they hit on so many points, and sort of there with Sam, just to add on a few more. And one is that, yeah, if you make a lot of the false promises are often based around trying to help people get better livelihoods as a first step, right? Rather than talking about biodiversity and conservation, do they see their environment changing? Do they want to take steps? Do they have tenure? Would they like help getting tenure? Do they know how to do the monitoring, right, of different wildlife species, right? And really using that as the entry point, to be honest, because we are conservation biologists. And as our founder, Rob Horwich, said, when he went in and talked to communities in this way about the importance of the biodiversity, sometimes they value the environment, they see it degrading, but they don't know also that they have a species that exists nowhere else, right? And so when we start sharing knowledge like that and some of the science, that can also really pull them in different ways. And you start there, and then sometimes, you know, the livelihoods can be built into that. But that's often where the false expectations come from, right? Either we're going to bring in big projects to do this and pay you lots of money to do biodiversity conservation, or we're going to make you less poor, right? We're going to have a livelihood solution. And those are just so hard in conservation, right? We've seen so many failures in that area. So that's you know, one thing about false expectations. And then also just to stress again, yeah, if it's not, you know, you're trying to help them to get tenure and able to manage and monitor and enforce some land of their own, right? So they can both, you know, have power over their own communities and other people aren't telling them what to do, but also keep outsiders out. And so in a place like Nepal, where we work, there's already community forests. So the communities already have all that. In Sam's case in Peru, they're trying to help them get tenure, or in Cameroon, in the areas they're working. In Nepal, 30% of the forest is already in community forestry. So they've all got tenure, but what they don't have, because a lot of countries don't tie like community forestry to wildlife in community context, is they don't have much around wildlife. They're not doing much to protect wildlife. They don't have much capacity building going on there. That's for protected areas, right? That's for the national parks, right? So trying to sort of expand people's ideas and what do they have in their forests? They don't always think about it. So like with our pangolin project, most people haven't seen a pangolin, even if it's right there in their forest. So just sort of, again, providing that sort of, you know, are you interested in learning more about your forest? And they never say no, right? There's always people in the community who want to learn more, even if they're already protecting it. They want to learn more and learn how to manage and sustainably, you know, extract, if that's what they're doing, or protect those species from illegal traders from the outside, because it's their national and local heritage, right? They don't want outsiders taking it if they know what to do to stop it and they know what species and where they're at. Yeah, I'll stop there. Big topic.
So I want to actually stick to the topic of local collaboration, but I want to shift a little bit from communities to law enforcement. So how much of your work involves actual like local law enforcement, and what's the benefit of having them collaborate with you on projects, or vice versa? Have there been instances where, you know, law enforcement has actually been a barrier to achieving what you're trying to achieve? Because we do see that in certain communities where, you know, the institutions that are there, that includes local authorities and law enforcement, can often be working against sort of the solutions that we in this space are trying to work towards. And let's start with Sam. We haven't started with Sam before.
Okay. I got a lot to say about that on the community side, but I'm going to stick to one of the other main focuses of our work, which is the fight against illegal wildlife trafficking. And there, you know, you have to work with the national and the local authorities. We're not policemen. We can't go out and confiscate animals. We can't go out and arrest people. What we found is that generally, at least in Latin America, the laws on paper are fabulous. You know, everything's protected and there's very stiff penalties, but the application on the ground is what's lacking. There was decentralization in Peru a few years ago of environmental powers, not national parks, but timber and wildlife. And so it got divided up between all the different regional governments, state governments would the equivalent. And so it really, really depends on local politics. If the regional president has a environmental focus in his politics, or their politics, sorry, then probably the regional environmental authority will be well funded. If the environment is not a priority for the regional government, mining is the biggest industry in Peru. So many regions, the regional government focuses on mining. So obviously environment is very low down. And even within the environmental authorities, you know, timber, taxable goods, things like that are given higher priority than wild animals. We have a lot of times where, you know, we've identified or been notified of animals being trafficked or held illegally. And one of the main problems of dealing with that is that the wildlife authorities don't have access to a car. They have to book it 2 weeks in advance. You can't really go and do an urgent operation 2 weeks in advance. It's also, there's a lot of corruption in Latin America, as there is across the globe. That's another major issue. But what has really been great is when you do get an interested authority. It might not be the president, it might not be the head of the wildlife authority, but someone within the agency who cares. They will then put their heart and soul into finding a way to rescue those animals or to stop those traffickers. And that has really been, you know, the major help that we've had, or the major way we've been able to help, is to be able to accompany these dedicated individuals to uphold the law, for want of a better expression. So yeah, we do have a lot of work together with local authorities, and it really depends on local politics and on individuals within the agencies on how successful you're going to be.
Dennis or Teri, do either of you want to add anything to that?
I can add that I think what Sam is saying applies to throughout the tropics. Where for example, I take the case of Cameroon. Cameroon has the best forestry policy in Central Africa, or maybe even West Africa, and other countries like the Congo are now only beginning to model on the Cameroonian law and create their own policy. The problem there is implementation. The problem there is political will. The problem there is corruption. The problem there is all of these things. That is why I think law enforcement remains a vital part of wildlife conservation and the protection of forests. But after trying law enforcement and criminalization for 50 or 100 years from now, there is a need for a holistic and diversified approach to wildlife management. There has to be genuine attempts to engage and involve local communities, not only in the management and access and science and research and whatever, but in also regulating and monitoring wildlife within the forests that they have traditionally relied on. And that comes from recognizing rights, from giving land, recognizing land tenure and awarding that where it's necessary. That comes from allowing these groups, giving them the capacity to achieve some level of self-determination, to have an active voice in both the decisions, but also the revenue that is generated from the extraction of forest resources. And it is by doing this and working with the communities that, governments are usually, in the case of Cameroon, where I know so well, the law enforcement officer is 500 kilometers away, and the wildlife is being poached at the community level. And if the community is willing, if the community wants the person who is illegally taking wildlife to be punished, they will relay that information, the person will be punished. If the community does not care, or the community does not want the person to be punished, he will not be punished. because there's no way the wildlife officer or the wildlife enforcer is going to know. And so building a bottom-up approach to conservation has to be seriously considered, and not only providing lip service to it, because there's a lot of literature out there that all communities must actively be involved. Community, civil society organizations on the ground who are working within the communities have to be funded and actively involved. But if you look at where the money is going, it's going to the big people and it's going to the governments, and it's where it is. There has to be, I think, more than just lip service provided to a bottom-up approach to and a holistic approach to conservation. And that includes law enforcement, but it must also include community-based monitoring. It must also include community capacity development. It must also include any other thing that is going to help the communities be better stewards of their wildlife.
And I guess I'll just add, thinking about what both Denis and Sam said, yeah, it is so important to have the communities actively trying to protect, because they are the first line of defense and the ones most invested. So you've got a lot of leaders and heroes there, and there's examples all over the world, right, of people stopping other people and getting in danger themselves and things. But then you need those heroes across every scale, right? Because wildlife is one of those issues that crosses landscapes and borders in the wildlife trade. So the heroes, like Sam was saying, the leaders, right? When we talk, I mean, to use a jargony term, polycentric governance, where we need stakeholders like in the government and policy and NGOs, right? You need people standing up everywhere. The community certainly can't do it alone. Yeah, and trees don't move, so it's just so different thinking about that kind of conservation versus these wildlife that are so valuable across the world.
So I want to go back on something that you're again all touching on a little bit, and we have some questions in the audience Q&A, and so I'll get to those, I promise. But just quickly, I wanted to ask, so Denis mentioned a holistic approach to conservation, and so I think he was talking about it in a bit of a different sense, but I want to bring it to sort of the strategies or the approaches you use in the work you do. And so I know that all of you utilize both sort of two ends of a spectrum, if you will. So more like high-tech approaches and then more community-based or traditional approaches, word of mouth, that sort of community engagement element versus, cell phones, drones, that new sort of conservation. How do you balance those two spectrums in your work? If you could speak to that a little bit.
I think looking across our projects, because we are so community focused, and Sam and Denis may have other experiences with their more specific projects, but generally we are so focused on the communities and trying to figure out what works for the communities. And often that's not very fancy stuff, right? Because it has to be sustainable and stuff they can do over the long term, and transects, easy monitoring, right? But on the other hand, there's so many amazing technologies and apps that you can use now. So it's out in the forest with Denis in Cameroon, and there was an outsider who lived in the community for 20 years, and he's writing down the names of all the species that we're seeing, right? And then he said he was trying to find out all the scientific names when he actually had cell service. And I pointed out iNaturalist to him, right? That like, oh, you can post on iNaturalist and people. So I think I know for our own work, there's a lot of untapped potential that we've been thinking about for a long time, and the different monitoring apps, right? So some of the projects do have monitoring apps where people can put in they're monitoring, and they can actually put into their phone what they're seeing where, right? So there's a lot of stuff like that. And we haven't really, across our projects, we haven't done as much with it yet. But it is a whole new, whole open area in terms of communities accessing all that stuff. There's a lot of potential there.
I'm just gonna carry on with what Teri's saying. When we started the project in Peru, this is just 15 years ago, there was pretty much no cell phone reception in rural areas. Internet, we had to drive an hour to get a dial-up internet connection. And now pretty much every village has internet, has cell phone, has high-speed data connection. And we have, community partners who are using apps like Global Forest Watch, and they get alerts almost in real time of when there's been forest loss in their community reserve, and they can go and check it out. They've got a drone. They can go and collect evidence that way of illegal logging or whatever. But it all depends, as Teri said, like getting the community involved. You're not going to be able to use that kind of technology or communication in a village that doesn't have electricity or running water, probably. Yeah. So one thing you can, you can give a traditional talk, or you can take a little generator and a projector with you and do a conservation cinema for the weekend. That's something we've done, and it worked great. It all really depends, and that's one of the things about community conservation is it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. It's tailored to the individual communities from a toolkit that you pretty much have ready.
If I can add to that, I think the last 20 years have seen a tremendous change in the approaches to conservation with technology. And gradually, a lot of local communities are adopting these new technologies that are available, including now you can see around the world, community-based monitoring has become an important tool to get the communities participate and involved in the monitoring and conservation of their own species. But in order to, again, do it right, the communities must be at a level where they can use they can use this new technologies, and they should be able to freely decide that is a tool that is best for them. Yeah, but I think there are so many ways of doing it now, and internet connections and cell phones are getting better. It helps if when the data can instantly be, like Sam is saying, from the URI ping on a community cell phone, and they can go check it out. It helps when a community can go the other way, when a community can record an observation or a harvest or an illegal kill of a wildlife, and it goes straight to the authority, and then giving them less time to intervene and maybe bring the person who was done that to justice. So there's a blend of communication and data collection mechanisms out there that even community conservation can benefit from. Every community has to choose what is right for them, and it has not to be imposed. They have to agree to it and fully understand what they are agreeing to, what their privacy and all of those things are with whatever approach they choose to collect data, who is hosting that data, how are they going to have access to that data if they need it, and all of those things.
I'm just going to give one little anecdote of how complicated that is for the people, to even begin to understand what it means when we have just like a handful of camera traps out in some forests in Nepal. And as we're sort of showing them what they can do with camera traps, because they could buy their own and use that for monitoring and to see what's in the forest. But you realize that like they're getting people on the camera traps who are illegally entering, right? And it might be the chairman's brother, or it might be an outsider, or it might be, and then trying to figure out how you work with the community through those permutations. Yeah, so they really all thinking, what does this mean? How is this information going to get used? Who's going to use it? I mean, even that simple technology of camera trapping is really complex, right, to start thinking about. And a whole process we've got to integrate into our training somehow. I think once we started seeing that, we're like, no, I don't want to deal with that. And then one of our partners wanted to immediately report these people. Oh, we should be reporting. I'm like, we can't. It's the community's pictures, right? These are their photos. We can't be reporting. Anyway, it gets pretty complex pretty fast.
So that's another element that a common thread through all of those answers, and Dennis sort of spelled it out for us earlier, but it's really about having communities lead the way in terms of how they want to approach conservation, and making sure that you're not just working alongside communities, but they're really leading the way as far as, you can't force a solution upon them. It has to be led by them. And so that leads to one of our audience questions. So there's a growing amount of criticism against conservation, says Mark, and he's talking about the top-down approach where too often conservationists ask questions but seldom listen, population displacement, things like that. So I'm wondering if you can quickly touch on how your projects approach this so you don't fall into those traps, if we can call them that, how you build projects so they aren't the types of projects that Mark is describing, the criticized conservation projects.
I don't know if it's growing. It feels like it's been there forever, right? We've known that these are not the best approaches, but how do we actually flip it? But it still sticks, right? So I think for all of us, it's just obvious that is not what we want to be doing, right? And we've all committed ourselves to I think there's so much low-hanging fruit with communities that if we were working with all the communities to give them all the capacity they want and the ability to manage, some of those questions would still remain and be interesting. But at least for me, there's enough to do with communities. And if you're working from the bottom up, you're addressing a lot of those issues, right? That are the problems, I think. What do you guys think, Sam and Dennis?
I think it is the way the whole thing is structured. So a government in North America or in Europe or a big organization sends $1 million to a government in Cameroon or a big international NGO in Cameroon or in Peru. And these projects are written with what are immediate expectations within 1 year. So within 1 year, the level of this has to be done or that has to be done and that has to be done. And then the person now has to implement that project, has to make sure that he is seen positively by the donor so that money can continue to come in, goes in and does the best. Pressure tactics, everything to the local communities just to make sure that they can demonstrate, they can agree to something that he has to come back and demonstrate. Some of this involves changing people's livelihoods. That is what they have known, what they have learned from their grandparents, or what they know. It's now been labeled as illegal, and they have to turn around within a project cycle is usually 1 to 3 years, and be change agents that no longer hunt or no longer harvest wildlife, and therefore so the story can be told that the project is a success. That enforces a top-down approach that often backfires. Or often when these projects close, there's nothing to show for because people immediately go back to what they know best. And it is, as I said before, conservation will only work when the more people, local people, buy into the concept, why, can answer for themselves and for their communities, why and how, and for whose benefit, these kinds of questions, and have an answer that satisfies them, the more lasting solutions to wildlife protection will be found. If we could not do this, nobody has any patience at all. Projects have to end in 5 years. They have to demonstrate success and all of these things. Communities, there's no time to live with a community long enough to really understand their relationship with the wildlife, to capture their indigenous or local knowledge. There is no time to do an indigenous knowledge study, to actually know the complexity of relationship that already exists in the landscape you're intervening in. Because the project cycle is so short, you have to deliver. Then there will be no time for wildlife protection, and unfortunately. So I don't know if that actually speaks to the question, but it has to be patience. Patience is the way to go.
I'm just going to choose the second half of Mark's question, where he gives examples of population displacement, rangers shooting on site. And we, in our answers to varying degrees of the previous questions, mentioned, catching traffickers, prosecuting people, law enforcement. In no way, and I don't want this to be misunderstood, and I'm sure I'm speaking for Dennis and Teri as well, we're not talking about prosecuting local people for using natural resources or hunting in areas that they've always lived in, always occupied. In our projects, we help the local people who have lived in an area gain recognized protection or improve management of an area, or just protect the traditional management that they've always used and has been sustainable before these outside pressures came in. So I can't answer to really does top-down conservation work better or worse than bottom-up conservation at a global level. But in areas which are highly populated, high human populations, you need to have a bottom-up approach, in my opinion. As Dennis was saying, if you come in with a mega project, but you have to get results instantly, you're not going to achieve something. You might be able to say, yeah, we protected this many million hectares, but what's the cost? You've displaced possibly a population. You've banned communities from using resources they always used. You're either just shifting the problem somewhere else, or in 5 years or however long, the problem is going to come back, maybe larger than it was before. By helping local people manage and protect what they already have been managing and protecting for many years, probably, is in these situations possibly or probably the best way to go.
Thank you, Sam, and thank you, Dennis, and thank you, Teri. That's all we have time for. Unfortunately, we have a very back-to-back schedule here at the summit today, but if we're lucky, we'll see Teri, Sam, and Dennis at next year's World Rainforest Day, because this is actually the second year in a row that they're coming on to talk about wildlife and communities for World Rainforest Day. So everybody come back in 1 year and we can pick up where we left off. Thank you, Sam. Thank you, Teri. Thank you, Dennis. And thank you to everybody who tuned in. We have more events coming up soon, so stick around and thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks, Nia, for inviting us.
Thanks, everyone. See you next year.
Yep, we'll be here.